We've got the CSI Law and Order effect where everybody thinks the goal of every conversation is to get the I did it.
They can take a 15-year-old in, absent a parent and absent a lawyer.
They were convicted of murders despite DNA proving their innocence.
Well, welcome to Fill in the Blanks. We're talking about something I think you will find very interesting today. Many people don't know that the police are permitted to outright lie about evidence to someone they bring into the station for questioning. They are even permitted to lie to minors, even kids. Now, try explaining that to parents. My guests today have firsthand knowledge of this and are here to share their experience and expertise. Laura Nirider is a clinical professor of law and co-director of the Center on Wrongful Convictions at Northwestern Pritzker School of Law in Chicago. Now, Laura represents individuals who were wrongfully convicted of crimes when they were children or teenagers. Her clients have included Brendan Dassey, whose case was profiled in the Netflix global series Making a Murderer, and Damian Eccles of the West Memphis Three, whose case was profiled in the documentary West of Memphis. Dave Thompson is the president of Wicklander Zulawski and Associates, Inc. He is also a leader in non-confrontational interview and interrogation training. Now, he doesn't want to demonize police in any way, and like me, is a supporter of law enforcement. But there are some that abuse the system. Dave incorporated evidence-based investigative interrogation, which focuses on building genuine rapport, asking open-ended questions, and using academic research to train for investigative interviews. Together, they have a collaboration that, let's face it, is a bit unexpected. A defense lawyer and a law enforcement trainer, which they will also tell us about. So, Laura, Dave, welcome to Fill in the Blanks.
Thank you so much for having us. It's a pleasure to be here.
Yeah, absolutely. Definitely a unique partnership, but one that I think we both grown through that collaboration in the process.
Well, let's talk about how this came about, because frankly, a defense lawyer and someone that works on the police side of interrogation and training police officers on interrogation, these are not birds of a feather usually. So the two of you together, which I love, by the way, and we've worked together before. We've been on the show, the three of us, and I found both of you provocative and informative. But how did this come about, the two of you together?
Well, I'll let Dave tell the story, but it's just been one of the most incredible partnerships. And you're right; it's not every day that a defense attorney comes along and becomes a close colleague of somebody who's dedicated to training law enforcement. So I like to think of our evolution here as a way to build bridges and come together around some really important issues. I think most people don't know that police are allowed to lie to kids during interrogations, much less that police have been trained to do just that. This is being taught in all 50 states to our police officers, right? To our law enforcement that's out there on the streets. They're being taught to use these techniques. And, the history here is fascinating to me. These techniques in which we deceive and manipulate people during interrogation. These techniques were invented way back in the 1940s and 1950s, and they have gone untouched. They are still in use today, even though now that DNA hasn't been invented, we're realizing that people are falsely confessing due to this manipulation so much more often than anyone would ever have thought. So we're at this moment now of realization, thanks to DNA technology, that these old, outdated techniques, it's time to get rid of them and do something new.
Well, I couldn't agree more, but let me ask you something. I think I am misinformed or made a wrong assumption about this. But in all 50 states, and I know the laws vary and they tend to follow generally the federal guidelines, is it legal for interrogators to question a minor absent a parent?
In most states, that is legal. Now, most states require police, when they want to question your kid, to at least try to notify the parent, right? But a slim minority of states require the parent to actually be there. I think only 13 states require the parent to actually be there. So in most states, the police, if they come to your kid's school, they want to question your kid, they pick up the phone, they try to reach you, it goes to voicemail. They can check the box, they've satisfied their duty, and they can take your child and interrogate them without ever having actually spoken to you.
So they can take a 15-year-old in, absent a parent and absent a lawyer. If the kid doesn't request a lawyer or demand a lawyer, they can Mirandize that kid, lie to that kid about, hey, I'm going to read you your rights, but you're not in trouble here, and then interrogate a child who doesn't even understand the concept of making an admission against interest, doesn't understand what constitutes a violation of the law, doesn't understand what implicating him or herself in a crime might be, whose brain is not even almost finished growing and therefore can't predict the consequences of their actions, and interrogate that person for hours on end, get a confession and say, okay, we're wrapped here, cuff them and cage them.
You got it. You got it. Hundreds and hundreds of cases like that around the country where this happens. The child ends up, like you say, not understanding what their rights are in the room. What kid understands what exactly a right to a lawyer means or what a lawyer could do for them in that moment? 85% of people waive their Miranda rights. And that number gets even higher when you're talking about kids. Pretty soon, you got a kid who's being told falsely that there's a bunch of evidence against them. You've got a kid who's being told falsely that if they confess, right, they'll go home. But if they don't confess, they'll go to prison. And all of a sudden, you've got a kid who is prone to saying they did things that maybe never happened at all.
But see, we socialized kids to respect adults, to respect authority, to respect the police. And so they come in and say, okay, listen, here's what we know, and we're not focused on you. We just need to know what happened. And the kid may not understand conspiracy, may not understand any of the aspects or the elements of the crime, hasn't seen a jury charge ever, doesn't have any concept of what the test of the law is, and can make admissions against interest without understanding what he's admitting to or she is admitting to. That just seems to me to be such an unfair playing field.
Well, let me give you some good news. We've had 5 states in the last year and a half or so pass legislation that they're all a little different, but essentially makes these confessions inadmissible with juveniles if deception is used. And the reason I think that that's important is all the way back to 2012, the International Association of Chiefs of Police came out with a policy recommendation that you shouldn't use this tactic, lying, to our youth as a policy. And as we know, culture eats policy for breakfast. So we haven't seen a lot of departments implement that. But in the last few years, what we're seeing are departments take a stance on educating their investigators on how do we handle interviews with youthful offenders, witnesses, suspects differently than we did before. So we're seeing legislative policy, we're seeing training being different, and we're seeing social science brought into the training room.
Well, when I was at Courtroom Sciences, we ran as many as 10,000 mock jurors and respondents to venue surveys, all different kinds of things in a year. And one of the things I frequently ask them is, do you believe that, generally speaking, people would admit to a crime they didn't commit? And overwhelmingly, they said absolutely not. They just cannot conceive that somebody would admit to a crime they didn't commit. So they have a preconceived notion that if they said they did it, they did it. People just don't admit to something they didn't do. So if you get a confession, that weighs heavy on the jury. There's no question in my mind about that. But the truth of the matter is we're seeing, as you say, Laura, over and over, that that's just simply not the case.
Well, the cases that'll floor you, and I think are a great illustration of your point, Dr. Phil, are these cases in which, you bring a teenager into the interrogation room. They're questioned for hours using deceptive tactics. No parent, no lawyer. Kid is scared. Kid offers up a story finally because he thinks that's what he needs to do, offers up a confession. This has happened in Chicago all the time, actually, in a couple of cases most recently that I've worked on. The Dixmoor 5 and the Englewood 4, groups of teenagers actually were brought in and confessed to murders in these two separate cases. And what's amazing about these cases is that you've got kids confessing to these murders. And in both cases, before trial, the DNA evidence from the crime scene was tested. And it excluded every single one of these kids. These kids were ghosts at those crime scenes. They just weren't there. But because they had confessed in a courtroom in front of a jury, at the end of the day, they were convicted of these murders, despite DNA proving their innocence, because they'd confessed. That's how potent this evidence is. That's how powerful this belief, this myth, right, is that no one would confess to a crime they didn't commit.
And I think, I know Dr. Phil, you said, what's the remedy? I think one of the things, doesn't fix the problem, but it creates transparency, is recording of the interrogation. Because all too often that end confession is the only thing that a judge or jury sees. And that might be accurate, but it may have taken 30 variations of that story to become accurate. And if we don't see how that transpired, it looks like a reliable confession when in fact, it's the result of fact feeding and altering of a story for the last 2 hours in the room. So recording doesn't fix it, but at least provides transparency to how we got there.
And we saw that with Brendan Dassey. Clearly, this was a confession by successive approximation. Well, what did he do to her head? What did he do? And finally just tells him, and it says, well, why didn't you tell me that? Well, you didn't tell him that because you didn't know.
That's right. That's right. Here you've got a 16-year-old, 10th grade special education student, right, who is pulled into the police station. He's interrogated 4 times over a period of 48 hours, 3 of those times with no parent present, 4 of those times with no lawyer present. And you've got this kid who is told that he's going to be charged with murder unless he starts filling in the blanks of what the interrogators think happened. And he starts guessing because he's scared. And this whole thing's on tape, right? All these interrogations are on tape. And you can just watch his story, reflect what the interrogators are telling him. And they get to this point, the most important point, right? This is a murder case. The most important point of this whole interrogation is, did you kill her? And if so, how? Right? And the interrogators know that she had been killed by being shot in the head. So that's what they're looking for Brendan, for this special education student, to say. So they say to him on tape, right? How was she killed? And this is one of the most unbelievable sequences of any interrogation tape I have ever seen. Because here's this 16-year-old, and he says, did we stab her? No, something else, Brendan, something else, they say. What else? We choked her? No, something else. And he goes through this whole guessing game of ways to kill someone. At one point, he's so confused. They have to start giving him hints. They say to him, Brendan, it's something with the head. You did something with the head. And he's so confused. He says, we cut off her hair? And this goes on and on and on. It's just painful to watch until he gives up. He says, I can't think of anything more, at which point they have to say to him, they have to tell him the right answer. They say to him, Brendan, I'm just going to come out and ask you who shot her in the head. And he says, oh, well, that was my uncle, right? Who was also there in this story. And they said, why didn't you just tell us that, right? Why are you rattling off all these other things? Why didn't you just tell us that? And Brendan looks up and he says, because I couldn't think of it. He's guessing.
When I saw that initially, I just thought, why didn't they just write it out and tell him he was signing his release paper and have him sign it? It would have been just as valid.
Why didn't they have him confess to, shooting Elvis on the moon while they're at it? I mean, it's just, they could have gotten him to say anything in those moments, I think, pretty much anything at all.
Dave, what did you think about that when you saw it?
Well, that moment, and actually another moment shortly after that, and Laura, you could correct me if I'm wrong. I don't know if the jury saw, but when Brendan's mom enters the room and he, immediately starts to recant essentially, and the pressure has been relieved from him, and he's asking if he can go back to school. Like clearly you can see that Brendan has no idea what he just acknowledged. He has no idea what just happened. He doesn't think there's any consequences to it. And he tells his mom right away, they got to my head. And that's the part that just struck with me. And I'll also tell you that these video clips that we're talking about, we've shown these clips to over 50,000 investigators the last several years as examples of how not to conduct interviews. And regardless if you have an innocent or a guilty person in the room, when you contaminate an interview the way that Laura just described, it removes any reliability to that admission. Right? How are we supposed to identify this person's being truthful or not? We just told them everything they're supposed to say. So I think it's just a prototype of a false and unreliable confession.
Well, think about how many interrogations go on, how many interviews or interrogations, however somebody approaches it, go on every day. I think the vast majority of them don't have ill intent. I think they're trying to get to the truth, get to the bottom, find out what happened, and hold the right people accountable. I'm a huge supporter of law enforcement from the bottom to the top. But man, when you get something that goes awry, I think depriving someone of their liberty in the United States is a very high standard, and it should be. Depriving someone of their life is the highest of high standards, and well, it should be. There's got to be some kind of standard, some kind of review, check and balance system here. And having spent so much time in the litigation arena, I've told my staff here, if you get stopped, you get in juxtaposition to some crime, you don't want to say anything about anything to law enforcement. You need to get a lawyer and don't say anything. What advice do you guys give to your friends off the record if there's been a shooting, an incident, a bad car wreck, something that they're even tangentially involved with? What do you tell people when the police show up? How do you tell them to conduct themselves?
I'll answer that because I think it's unique from my perspective. Call an attorney. And I think the same thing happens. I think police officers that we train tell their family the same thing, because even by saying, obviously, be respectful and cooperate, which makes sense, but cooperate is part of the problem, right? Because we all perceive what cooperate means differently. If that's starting to give up information that you don't realize is going to incriminate yourself, even if incidentally is an obstacle. And even with kids, so parents that are listening, parents are often the worst person to be in the room with their child during an interview. They're not giving good legal advice. They could be victim of the same technique. So you have the right to representation, use it.
No question about it. I'm a mom. I've got 2 little boys in school. And one advice I give, my mom friends out there is put a letter on file with your kid's principal at their school saying, you know what, if a police officer shows up at school, wants to question my child, right? This child, I am asserting for them their right to a lawyer. In this letter, they have representation. I will get them representation. I do not want them questioned without me and without a lawyer.
Wow, what good advice right there from both of you. And I hadn't thought about the letter. Dave, I agree with you 100%. I've had cases where someone has died in the home and the spouse's parent has shown up to support, and they just took them to the police station as witnesses, not as suspects, and listened to them talk. The spouse says, just feeling guilty, says, "Oh my God, I just feel horrible. I just blame myself." That was the beginning of them winding up in prison and ultimately committing suicide. And it began with them saying to their parent, "I blame myself."
That's terrible.
And they didn't mean I caused the death. It's just, I should have been there. I should have, been more sensitive. I should have seen this coming. I should have, how you self-recriminate when you didn't foresee something. And they wound up in prison and couldn't take it. And both of the children wound up without a parent because one was dead and the other killed himself in prison. And it all started with, I blame myself.
I think we see the same. It's a terrible, but a good example of that. I think we see the same often with wrongful death of a child or child abuse, or teachers, parents, caretakers that feel this guilt and remorse, and they're in this kind of state of trauma after something happened. And those types of spontaneous utterances can be easily misconstrued or used in the wrong way. So I think that's really, really important advice.
Yeah, and as we know, admission against interest is an exception to the hearsay rule, so they can use that and you're screwed. I just tell them, don't say a word. It's too bad because I think that so many of these people that are the detectives, the investigators, are out there really trying to figure out what really happened. And the bad thing is when you get a false confession and you convict the wrong person, that means the wrongdoer is still out on the street.
Yeah, and I think part of that is, for you asked for advice for maybe parents or listeners, but the law enforcement folks that are listening, or those that have a phone and want to call and see how their department's training. When you look at investigators right now, most departments, maybe annually or biannually, they have to get qualified on how to shoot a weapon, how to fire a weapon. They have to get trained and certified on use of force, on a taser, on how to drive their vehicle. But for interview and interrogation, which is we're talking about this whole session here and how powerful that is, it's often go to a 2 or 3 day class or learn on the job, and one class for 20-year career, you're good. And what we need is more required mandated education and accountability when people aren't compliant with it, just like every other task that they have on the job. And because we're now seeing how powerful these tools are when they're used improperly.
Yeah, people don't know the psychological subtleties of this and what's going on. We know psychologically, if you can keep somebody from making a denial, if they start to make a denial and you can stop them short, even if you just jump in and say their name, if they start to say, I didn't, Dave, let me ask you something else. If you can just stop them, they're a lot more likely to ultimately confess if you don't let them dig a hole and they have a face-saving way out. There are so many subtleties that people don't understand. And if they're using all of those things to back somebody into a corner, if you're a civilian, you can't know what all is going on in there. You need to have a lawyer and you need to zip it. You never have to talk to them ever, correct? If you are charged with a crime, you never have to give an interview or a statement.
Correct. That's exactly right. You never need to, and you should not do it. Instead, you ask for that lawyer.
Yeah. Hope somebody comes and files a civil suit before you have to go to trial and you get some discovery, because you don't ever have to say doodly squat. It just doesn't happen very often, but sometimes it does. Well, guys, I really appreciate you taking time to talk about this, because if enough people hear us, if enough people pay attention to this, maybe we can change people from thinking innocent people don't confess, because that's just not true. And we've proven that with the advancement of DNA technology, where it's not a question. We see that it does happen time and time and time again, and it happens more and more with people that are less equipped to fight back against the techniques. And maybe we can get people to not be so close-minded about that. And maybe we can contribute to the catalyst for changing the techniques that are being used. I think when people commit bad crimes, they should be held accountable to the full extent of the law. But let's make sure we've got the right people.
Well, amen. I agree with that 100%. Let's make sure we got the right people. And you are absolutely right. This is a moment of education. I think people are listening now, questioning the way things have done, maybe opening their minds after they're watching shows like yours and hearing stories like these. And there is a better way forward. There's a path forward that will let us make sure the right people are locked up and the right people are free. And that's why, we're so glad to be collaborating with you, Dr. Phil, and, Dave, why I just take my hat off to the good work that you've been doing with law enforcement here, learning from these stories to make sure they don't happen again.
Yeah, and positive from the law enforcement side, there's a lot of good news out there. There's a lot of major cities, major departments that have already adopted, investigative interviewing techniques, already recording everything, have specialized interviewers for juveniles, have trauma-informed interview training. So there's a lot of departments that have acknowledged this and command staff that are doing the right thing. So slow and steady, we're getting there, but there is some positive trends out there.
Well, there certainly are. And again, my hat's off. We've got 800,000 plus men and women who put that uniform on every day and step into the gap to keep the rest of us safe. I support them. My hat's off to them, and God bless them for doing what they do. And I support them enough to be able to acknowledge when certain things need to change to make it even better. I don't have to turn a blind eye to it because I support them enough that I can admit when there are certain things that need to change. And this is one of those things that need to change. I'm working on Richard Glossop's case in Oklahoma, and that poor guy has had his final meal 4 times. His final meal 4 times, and they're still trying to kill this guy. And I've got, I think it's 19 state senators and congressmen up there who are pro-capital punishment who say he should be turned loose. They say, yeah, we're pro-capital punishment. We just want to be sure we're executing the right person. We're pro-capital punishment. We just don't think he's the one. So they've come out and said, turn him loose, and we still can't get him turned loose. But we're working on it. We're working hard on it. And I'm going to continue to fight for those that I think are unjustly in prison and on death row. I'm going to fight till my last breath. And God bless you guys for what you're doing. And if I can help in any way, I'll write letters, I'll make phone calls, I'll come stand up for you, whatever. Just let me know.
No, thank you. And thanks for this platform.
You, Dr. Phil. Thank you very much.
All right, well, we'll talk again soon. I'm sure you guys have done a great job of explaining this today. I think a lot of people understand things now that they didn't when we started talking. And I appreciate you being on the show. I appreciate you being here, and we'll talk again soon. Okay.
Right. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, Laura. Thanks, Dave.